Welcome to The Explainer. Today we are unpacking a history that is as deeply layered and turbulent as it is fascinating. We're talking about Jamaica. This is an island literally forged in the fires of empires, built on unimaginable struggle, that somehow birthed a cultural identity that echoes across the globe. So let's dive right in and uncover this incredible story together.
You know, when most of us picture Jamaica today, we're probably picturing the travel brochure on the left. You know, the one, palm fringe beaches, massive all-inclusive resorts, pure relaxation. But to truly understand this island nation of 2.5 million people, we really have to look at the historical reality on the right. Because the truth is, the paradise that tourists see today was built on a very dark, complex foundation of colonialism, forced labor, and absolutely fierce rebellion.
Here is exactly how we'll unpack over 1,000 years of history today. 1. Conquest and the first Jamaicans. 2. Sugar, slavery, and rebellion. 3. The fight for independence. 4. A global cultural phenomenon. And 5. Modern realities, tourism, and turmoil.
All right, let's jump straight into part 1, Conquest and the first Jamaicans.
To get our bearings, let's walk through this rapid timeline. So around 600 AD, the Taino people arrived from Cuba. They called the island Jamaica, the land of wood and water, and they built a peaceful society there for centuries. But, as we know, the globe shifted in 1494 when Columbus showed up and claimed the island for Spain. Fast forward after about 150 years of Spanish control, and the British seized Jamaica in 1655. This drastically shifted the imperial power dynamics in the Caribbean forever.
Now, the human cost of those early colonial years, it's honestly staggering. Spanish chroniclers originally reported a population of about 60,000 Tainos, but that number plummeted to zero, literally zero. Between introduced European diseases, the grueling forced labor of the Spanish encomienda system, and violent warfare, the Taino population suffered a horrific demographic collapse. By the time the British arrived in 1655, their lineage had essentially vanished from the island.
Which brings us to Section 2, Sugar, Slavery, and Rebellion.
So, the British completely transformed the island's economy, and to do that, they needed labor. The demographics shifted on a massive scale. Look at this. In the late 1670s, the entire island's population was only about 15,000. But to fuel these rapidly expanding, highly lucrative sugar plantations, the British started importing vast numbers of enslaved Africans. By the late 1700s, 180,000 enslaved people. And by 1820, that number skyrocketed to 340,000. It is wild to think about, but this immense imperial wealth was built entirely on the backs of chattel slavery.
But, and this is absolutely crucial to remember, the enslaved population didn't just accept this fate. They fiercely fought back. Enter the Maroons. These were escaped enslaved Africans who fled into the rugged, mountainous interior of the island. They formed their own independent communities and waged such effective guerrilla warfare against the British Empire that the British, who were led by brilliant Maroon strategists like Cudjoe and Accompong, were actually forced to surrender. There was simply no way to beat them, so the British had to sign peace treaties with them in the 1730s.
Now, you might be thinking, okay, slavery was officially abolished throughout the British Empire in 1834. Boom, freedom, right? Well, actually, scratch that. Emancipation didn't mean immediate freedom. The British implemented this incredibly traumatic, unpaid apprenticeship period. As you can see, depending on your age, your actual freedom was delayed for years. It was essentially a calculated, bureaucratic loophole. They just wanted to maintain the plantation structure and force emancipated people to keep doing grueling work without pay until 1838.
Moving right along to Section 3, the fight for independence.
Over a century after emancipation, the descendants of that colonial system really began organizing to claim political self-determination. In 1938, severe labor riots over poor working conditions sparked a massive political awakening. And out of this unrest, Jamaica's two major political parties were forged, the PNP and the JLP. From there, it was like a snowball effect. This unstoppable momentum led to universal adult suffrage in 1944, and finally, on August 6, 1962, the lowering of the Union Jack and the birth of an independent nation.
I think this idea is captured perfectly by the brilliant Jamaican scholar Sylvia Wynter. She wrote, "The struggle of the majority of our people to transform ourselves from being the object of the history of other nations into the agent and creative subject of our own. So independence wasn't just some political shift on paper, you know? It was a profound, deeply personal reclaiming of Jamaican humanity and agency."
Let's get into Section 4,
a global cultural phenomenon.
Out of this crucible of struggle came a dynamic culture that completely projected Jamaica's voice across the globe. And what's really cool is that you can actually trace the social history of the island just by listening to the evolution of its music. Think about it. In the highly energetic 1950s, you had ska. By the late 60s, as the sobering realities of independence began to set in, the tempo slowed down into rock steady. Then the 1970s brought reggae, heavily percussive, deeply political. And finally, the 1980s saw the rise of dancehall, which reflected a gritty shift toward the urban experience.
And of course, no explainer on Jamaica is complete with Bob Marley, right? He famously said, "Positive vibrations, mon, that's what makes it work." It is honestly incredible that a small island nation turned its local music into a massive global cultural commodity. Reggae connected local Jamaican struggles against poverty with universal messages of human rights. It literally allowed Jamaica to communicate its soul to the entire world.
And that brings us to our final section, Part 5, Modern Realities, Tourism and Turmoil.
Because, as it turns out, the post-independence era proved incredibly challenging. The 1970s and 1980s were marked by intense political violence. The ideological rivalry between the two main parties, the PNP and the JLP, literally spilled out into the streets. What started as reactive clashes morphed into strategic territorial warfare among gangs aligned with these political factions. It deeply divided the nation, creating a wave of social breakdown that seriously challenged the unity they had won during independence.
At the same time, economically, the country was undergoing an absolute earthquake of a structural shift. Right after independence in 1963, agriculture accounted for 28% of Jamaica's GDP. But fast forward to 2010, and that number plummeted to just 7%. The agricultural foundation that the island was built upon for centuries basically dwindled, which forced the nation to desperately seek out entirely new ways to generate income.
So what did they do? To replace agriculture, Jamaica turned to tourism, and today it's an industry that pulls in upwards of $2 billion. But consider the stark contrast here, going back to our brochure from the beginning. While tourism brings a flood of foreign capital and international visitors to these beautiful, gated luxury resorts, it very often leaves local Jamaicans completely alienated. Land leases create these physical buffers, restricting locals from having a true economic stake in their own landscape, while high poverty persists literally just miles away from the all-inclusive beaches.
Which leaves us with a final and honestly a very provocative question today. As Sylvia Winter may prompt us to ask, has Jamaica achieved true freedom? Sure, political independence was won, the flag went up in 1962, but when you look at the legacy of colonial economic structures, the crazy wealth disparities of modern tourism, and the battles with internal violence, the struggle for true structural freedom isn't just a chapter in a history book. It's a battle being fought right now. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep learning, keep questioning, and I'll see you all next time.